Well, good evening, afternoon, students, teachers, and the generally curious. This is another episode with the Friends of Publius. We're joined this evening, as always, by Dave Richmond from Bakersfield, California, Chris Kavanaugh from Bismarck, North Dakota, and J. Michael Williams from San Diego, California. I have a man cave. Albeit it is devoid of a big screen TV, the beer fridge, posters of my favorite sports teams. In saying that, some may wonder if I even have electricity in this man cave. I do. But the electricity in my man cave is used for tools. Tools used for working with wood. I by no means claim to be a master craftsman in this endeavor. Alas, I am an amateur, a weekender, if you will. But I've noticed something over the years in working with wood. It teaches you humility. Oh, does it teach you humility? Turns out wood is the true master in the relationship. It commands my respect. It points out my mistakes. It reveals endless varieties of nature. Did you know? Did you know that there are over 200 varieties of maple? There's over 1,500 varieties of oak. There's over 1,000 varieties of acacia wood. Wood also demands patience. Regrettably, I'm still learning all these virtues. Respect, acceptance, awe, humility. Recently, I was given a piece of wood. I'd heard of this variety of wood, but I've never worked with it. It's called ipe, or otherwise more popularly known as Brazilian ironwood. It's called ironwood for good reason. It is so hard. You can't glue it. You can't drive nails through it. You can't paint or stain it. In fact, I swear the other day I heard a piece of ipe whisper, "I own you, rookie." I immediately dropped the piece of wood, bowed in submission and reverence. It's still sitting there in the corner, mocking me. Another thing I've learned in my escapades in woodworking is that the use of tools also is an exercise in humility. I originally believed that tools would cure this, but turns out you need to master, using tools will teach you humility as well. It turns out that you need to acquire all manner of wisdom in using tools, the intricacies of blade depth on a hand plane, precise angles necessary in cutting crown molding using a compound miter saw, bit speed when using a router to make edging on a tabletop. There have been many mistakes, my friends, in these attempts, most of which wind up in my fire pit. I'm considering upping my game in the woodworking endeavor. I'm thinking about getting a wooden lathe. I got this notion that I can make bowls, I guess. Salad bowls. Heck, I've watched all kinds of YouTube videos. Shouldn't that make me an expert? If I'm honest, though, I think the lathe will probably deliver plenty of lessons in humility. It may prevent me from actually buying the lathe. But the upside is if I do get one, there'll be more kindling for my fire pit. Lastly, working with wood has also put me in touch with a couple of guys here in town. I consider them true master craftsmen. Talking with them is a delight, but it also is an exercise in humility. They know tons of stuff. I consider them mentors. They are the swamis of cedar, the maharishis of maple, the tutors of teak. For me, to admit that I needed their help and advice by nature is a humbling experience, but necessary in a mentorship relationship. But it, I think, is the first step in true learning. Well, gentlemen, I have 3 events tonight, and our task is to not rank them, but which is the most important. In 1846, Morton demonstrated the use of ether in a surgery. In 1859, John Brown raided a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. In 1923, Walt Disney founded the Walt Disney Cartoon Studio. So let's lead out here. Professor Kavanaugh, which is the most important of those three?
Dang. Um, dang. I'm gonna have to go with John Brown. I think John Brown and his actions at Harper's Ferry hastens the Civil War. I mean, we were probably on our way anyway to that event, but I think his actions there gave the planter elite in the South a real live boogeyman to say this is what's going to happen if a crazy white guy from the North is going to come in and arm our enslaved population, then do we really want to be part of this country? So as much as ether was important, I'm going to go with, and certainly the Disney dynasty that is today, holy smokes. I mean, Walt Disney realized in how many decades they would run part of the world. But I'm going to go with John Brown simply from an American history point of view.
David.
Disney. To me, it's not even debatable. As well as Chris has articulated the importance of John Brown. As far as how we live today, it is no doubt Disney and animation and entertainment and global corporate influence over the minds of the peoples of the world. It's Walt Disney there. So that's where I'm at.
J. Michael.
I'm going to go with John Brown. Two reasons. One is
you've been reading a lot of books about the 19th
no,
century.
I haven't been reading
right, exactly.
I haven't been reading as much, but I did read something that it was interesting that Frederick Douglass, for a long time, advocated violence against the slavery system, but he had changed by 1859, and he encouraged people not to follow John Brown. He thought that it was workable that the Constitution was actually a liberty document and not a slavery document. So I think about his changing in that. And the other reason I'm bringing it up is I was talking to students today. There's this book by this scholar Matthew Desmond called Poverty Made by America, and at the end of it he talks about poverty abolitionism, and he talks about what if we could envision a world where we abolish poverty. And I had some students raise their hands and kind of push back, saying this could never happen. And I'd also had them learn about I.W. Wells and Frederick Douglass at the beginning of the semester. And so I just put it out there. I said, well, think about how fast things changed from the 1840s to 1865, and with John Brown from 1859 to 1865. So I don't know. It's one of those events that I agree with David. The Disney Corporation and what it did to Southern California, what it did to our understanding of marketing, and it's a lasting effect. But I like John Brown as a reminder about things can change relatively quickly in this world, despite what the obstacles may look like.
I got to go with ether.
Of course.
I mean, or anesthesia in general. Having recently been the recipient of two surgeries. So yeah, I think I'd like to see the numbers of people that are impacted by ether and the impact of each of these. And David actually might be right if we do a statistical study of impact. But I'd like to think ether should be ranked up there. So.
Just so we know, the surgeries would still happen without the ether, Tim.
Oh, yeah. And did after the invention of ether too. Civil War. Yeah, that leg's got to go.
Yeah.
Your
Well,
bite on this stick.
thank
David,
you.
up to you now.
Thank you, Professor Moore. It's nice to hear about your wood. It's another beautiful day in Trump's America as we get ready to present episode 172 of the Constitution of American Life, otherwise known as the FOP Journey Down Constitution Nostalgia Lane. In today's discussion, we're going to be focusing on Unit 1 from the We the People curriculum, which addresses the historical and philosophical foundations of American political thought. Specifically, we are going to be looking at America's colonial period and the emphasis on classical Republican theory, as well as presenting a lively discussion on human nature and its significance. Or better yet, who was truly right, Locke or Hobbes? So let's turn to our poster child of the common man who represents real America from the heartland, loves really fine wood, as we just learned, power tools, and taking pictures of his own feet, Professor Tim Moore. Tim, in your view, do colonial charters truly reflect the ideas of classical republicanism?
Um, no and yes, or no, yes and no. Um,
You sure about that?
yeah, I'm very convinced that it's kind of yes and no. Uh, Again, the devil's in the details here. I guess I'm going to make an argument, and this may this I kind of hope this will rankle Chris's sensibilities a little bit.
I have
Which,
sensibilities.
well, I'm giving you credit here,
Okay,
cowboy. Come on.
thank you. I appreciate that.
So I'm going to say that the early colonial world operated, well, let me back up. There's this notion that there's a difference between covenants that are created versus charters or constitutions that are created in the founding period. A lot of my thinking has been influenced by an author by the name of Donald Lutz. The name of the book is The Origins of American Constitutionalism. He says that when they hopped off the boat, and this is largely religious people, when they hopped off the boat, they created covenants. And that's different than what would later come in terms of their colonial charters or constitutions, as they, like the Connecticut or Massachusetts Body of Liberties. So a covenant is different than a constitution, even though in both you'll find the language that sounds a lot like classical republicanism. In other words, the importance of virtue, the importance of the common good. So there's a lot of language in the covenants that they make right after they hop off the boat and create a people that sounds similar to the classical, the ancient Greek and Roman classical republicanism. I mean, covenants essentially are characterized by an agreement that has a transcendent as the witness, and in religious people's cases, this is God. There's usually a statement about why we're creating this people. They create a people. They literally create an identity. They often create a church associated with those people. And there's also a teleos, meaning we're going to state the down the road purpose of this covenant. And for many of those groups, it was like for the glory of God. So in a covenant, there's like a vertical thing going on. I think in a lot of the later charters and constitutions, there's no transcendent as the sanction, which may, for some scholars, means that there's a very heavy duty seriousness because there's a vertical relationship to a divine being. Whereas as the charters and the constitutions are in many cases devoid of that divine presence, witnessing the creation of the people. There is the language of common good, but a lot of the common good in covenants is arguably to honor a transcendent, to honor God, whereas the common good articulation in the charters or constitutions are for more like a horizontal survival. So I think the common good purpose is different. They both exist in small communities. That's very easy to make that link between early American covenants and classical republicanism. There's a lot of language of virtue, but I think the nature and the purpose of virtue is different in the covenants. Now, this transition, according to Lutz, and I think he's right, happens within a generation. They make this leap from these covenant arrangements of community to more of a constitutional arrangement of communities. So by the 40s and 50s, 16, you start to see the explosion of the charters, and some charters are constantly revoked and redone. Covenants are so serious you don't mess with the covenant because there's a transcendent being overseeing this. So I say there's some differences, even though the language is very, very similar.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, it sounds to me like what Professor Moore is saying is because they were small and homogeneous, it was natural for them to embrace classical republicanism. I'm curious whether or not you agree with that, and to what extent would you say that history, experiential history of 17th century Americans had maybe more influence versus the practical theoretical world there. What are your thoughts?
They wouldn't have been 17th century Americans. So
Well, okay, thank you, Mr. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's important for students to remember that.
I did quotation marks.
Okay.
Did you see? Did you not see my quotation mark?
Okay, Mr. Fine Tooth Comb in the reading Richmond. Okay. I want to go back to with some of the stuff, kind of with your question, David, but also with some of the stuff Tim was addressing. I think it is interesting because you're talking about 16th, you talk about 17th and 18th century colonial development. And I think you have to look at the type of colonies that you see because, ultimately these charters are putting up royal colonies, right? I mean, they're all going to be royal, trade, promote self-government to a degree. But I think as you get more into the more corporate charters, you're going to see maybe a greater degree of classical republicanism. And it's going to be both by knowledge, their history, David, and practical experience for survival. I think it's going to be a good combination. I mean, I think there are like 4 areas. I think these colonial, maybe more so the corporate charters again, that reflect this classical republicanism. It's self-government and representative assemblies, right? You're going to have colonial charters permit formation of assemblies. Obviously by male property holders. I think Tim introduces to the term freeholders. You'll see that language in colonial charters, freeholders having a say. But the idea that popular sovereignty ultimately will reside with the people. So they're kind of planting the seeds there for that to expand. There's an emphasis on good government, right? I think that early republicanism stressed that citizens should they prioritize a common good over their individual interests because you want in these early colonies, survival was not guaranteed, and you're going to have to pitch in. I mean, look at the Jamestown. Oh my gosh! I mean, they're literally digging up corpses and eating corpses in Jamestown. So you're going to have to pitch in and work together. And that self-interest that Tocqueville is going to write about, it's not going to happen for a while. They established the rule of law. I think that's an important thing coming from classical republicanism. So the idea that charters often, they're going to guarantee colonists the rights as English subjects, and by doing that, setting the stage for perhaps the American Revolution in a little bit of time, right? Also, the idea of mixed government. I think in chapter 1 in the We the People book, they still have that great chart from Aristotle about the different forms of government, the right forms and the corrupt forms. And you see these in the early colonial charters, right? Was the idea of country party. You guys familiar with the idea of country party, the English opposition, right? They have these mixed forms of government. You got a governor, some monarchical, right? You've got perhaps an upper chamber that's maybe aristocratic and a lower chamber that's going to be more democratic. The idea of, again, dividing up power in these early colonial charters. So you do see, based on the history, but also from their practical experience of living in a wilderness, fighting Mother Nature and fighting the people that already live there.
So, Professor Williams, the question kind of moves from classical theory uh, to me what I used to believe was a really fundamental question to start a civics government class with, and that is human nature. So I'm wondering, as a political scientist and lawyer, to what extent, if any, do you believe that the nature of man influences how government is designed and structured?
I think it does, but this is such a straightforward but great question. Um, I think, I mean, what's always struck me about the founding generation, and Tim and Chris, please check me on this. The use of like assumptions about man and the nature of man were much more, I think, in their minds than it is, I think, well, how do I say this? They didn't have as much, they had to go way back in history to find out, okay, what happens when people try to live together in small r Republican or small d Democratic societies, right? There wasn't like a lot of examples around. So, do we want to have a Hobbesian mindset where we want a strong Leviathan, or do we want Madison? To me, is kind of a middle ground. Madison's like, okay, we can't trust people, but they're probably not as bad as Hobbes says. We're capable of virtue if we put in the right stuff. And then you have some folks who are the communitarians. It's like if you just get rid of all the exploitive stuff, we can just all live together in harmony. So I see them as debating it because they had models, but I don't know. It seems like it was more theoretical. When I think about Germany after World War II or South Africa after apartheid, I don't recall in those debates at this high level of nature of man at being articulated as a theory. It's like they have lived experiences about this is what human beings do to each other. In the case of Germany, in a place that started off as a democracy, the Weimar Republic, and in South Africa, a place that was claimed by the white regime to be democratic, except just not for the non-white citizens. So they designed their constitutions much more based on this lived experience. I mean, the South African Constitution has this thick section on emergency powers. And it's because they're not denying the fact that there might be a time for emergency powers, but they want to make really, really clear what the state can do in those times. Because during apartheid, emergency powers were out, thrown out as a way to really sort of hurt people without any rule of law. So I do think it informs. It seems to me for the 250 years we moved since the Declaration, hasn't there just been like data point after data point that people treat themselves pretty poorly, and that we should be super careful about giving a group of individuals with state power too much power, and then so it's going to be this like trying to find the Goldilocks, the right sort of government to set up with that. So I just don't think the founders had that kind of lived experiences at a national level that they could draw on. So it was more theoretical than it is today. I don't know if that made any sense at all,
No,
but
it did. So is the reason why we don't really talk about it? I mean, in 20th century governmental development and political, that the nature of man had already been answered, and so there was no need in the 20th and 21st century to really talk about it. Is that the reason why it's not really part of the conversation these days? Because it had already been answered?
Well, I think for some maybe, but I can't help but think that the 20th century is a real rebuttal to human nature being perfectible, good or perfectible. I mean, gosh, there are regimes in the 20th century have killed unbelievable, untold millions. So, um, I mean, it's a good question, David, whether we settled it or not. I guess I'd like to interject a different spectrum. As Mike and Chris were talking, I wonder whether the question could be asked, is man rational or irrational? As a part, okay, what is human nature? I think if you, and the reason I ask that is if you believe humans are rational, you might have a different kind of government system. If you believe humans are not rational, your system may look would likely look very, very different. So that's in addition to perfectible or hopelessly flawed or good or perfectible. So I think the rational, and I think that's especially true for those creating a constitution in the Enlightenment period, because reason and rationality is a basic principle, and our founders weren't willing to go to Rousseau's degree of 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 thinking. But I think rational and irrational might be another way to ask the question about human nature.
Well, okay. So you've kind of partly, addressed this. So does the view of human nature in classical thinking, all right, does it differ, all right, from the views of
Hmm.
human nature in Enlightenment thinking? Or do they both agree, if you're a Hobbesian Enlightenment thinker, do they both agree that human nature is irrational, can't be trusted, therefore you have to have internal and external checks on our behavior? Do both philosophies or theories that students are asked to deal with in the We the People text, do they agree on that one point about human nature?
I think there is some overlap. The way I read it. I mean, in the classical Republican model, humans are capable of virtue but corruptible. They're kind of squishy on that. They also, uh, well, where they might differ in terms of the Enlightenment thinkers are that the classical Republican world insisted that the community had an essential role in teaching the virtue. Whereas I think to the libertarian Enlightenment period, it was community wasn't necessary. Um, and obviously the classical Republicans thought human nature was such that government needed to be involved in the teaching of. They also believed that tradition was important, and that's where the community collective comes into play in the virtue, teaching the virtue. I mean, the Enlightenment folks believe in the reasonableness of humans to reach reasonable conclusion. And I'd say Hobbes is even believes that there's a rationality because mean, nasty, and brutish and short will logically force you into a contract. Uh, they do. They're a little more flexible in terms of progress of humanity than I think the classical Republicans. They believe in the possible of perfectibility of humans through reason. I think their commitment to universal principles of equality I think, has tremendous implications as to whether they think humans, or there are distinctions between humans, and if there are distinctions between humans, that can go sideways real fast. But equality may tether them to um, a notion that there's an equality between humans, and therefore government should be committed to that. The difference, I think, is they're more skeptical of tradition than the classical Republicans. I mean, I think it's formally called the skepticism of the Enlightenment, to view religious and political truths of the past with a fair amount of skepticism. Classical Republicans don't think that. So I think the main difference is how these work out rather than at a theoretical level, even though at the theoretical level there's some nuanced differences.
Well, that's where this seems to me to get kind of squishy, is that, and you've actually opened a door and, it's, some light to me. Maybe the origins of the view of government very much is developed by this tension between the two, because the classical Republicans, as you said, their view was that the polis had a responsibility to shape the people. Natural right thinkers, because that idea of the polis, or the community, the society in general having a role in that seems to be to some degree rejected by natural right thinkers, because that's giving government, which is an extension of the people, community, polis, too much power over the individual. Yet there's a problem, because even
Yeah.
if Jefferson is a product of the Enlightenment, he even argues that the government, society, has a responsibility to educate the people,
Right.
because an educated populace is so necessary to the function of Republican government.
Right. But I,
So,
I mean, even Jefferson's not willing to go as far as Rousseau's uh, minimalist government. So I think there's this is where I think the founders are really kind of mixed on this notion of human nature. Most of them, by my reading, tend to see Lincoln called it better angel, the better angels of our nature, that's there. I think the founders really were wrestling with history where it didn't look like that was so, but holding out hope that it was possible.
So this is really an area when students are asked to talk about the influence of these ideas. I mean, this seems to me an area where you can really play around with that, is looking at nature of man and how that impacts, the design of government. You see this tension, this squishiness between classical thought and Enlightenment thought. Chris, you wanted to jump in there.
Well, just my oversimplified view between the two, I always think in classical republicanism is that citizens are made, they're not born. But in the natural rights idea or in the liberalism of Locke, that citizens are born, right? You're born in, and you think about in our country today, you're born into citizenship, and because I am born a citizen, there's no necessarily not an obligation on my part to do anything for the betterment of the community, as opposed to if I was an Athenian, then when I'm born, and Tim already addressed this, the role of the government that is to make sure that I'm educated as a citizen, to make sure that Athens is running well, and I'm participating, as you said, Dave, as part of the polis. So I think it's a real simple, a very boiling down to citizens are made, and versus citizens are born.
Well, wouldn't you agree that Jefferson is a byproduct of Locke? And so how do you explain his great quote that it's incumbent upon the government to teach the people if they don't possess the virtues? Doesn't that sounds much more classical than enlightenment?
Does Jefferson say it's the government's role though to educate?
He says it's incumbent upon us to teach the
well,
people.
yeah, but that's the thing is like, and I question whether or not that's the government's role. And I know, I mean, certainly education was a big thing. You go back to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, holy cow, we're going to make sure we're providing for education. So we can see that in our founding documents. But certainly, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of a Madison quote about you don't take the ability away from the people, you educate the people. I mean, if the people are not up for good government, then you educate the people so you don't take that away from
Well,
them.
I think, yeah, I would say we're reading our modern education policy into the founding. And I think Chris's point's well taken. Is this mean a government entity does it the way we're comfortable, or some people are not quite comfortable, but we've gotten used to government doing that process that's described by Jefferson and Madison. Whereas back in that day, there were a lot of other entities that were involved in the inculcation of
Well,
virtues.
is the University of Virginia a government entity?
Yes.
Well, again, to me, seeing that as an expression of Jefferson's vision, it is government's job
Right.
to do that. If I look at the founding of the University of Virginia, Mike, you were clearly
Yeah, I
wanting
do.
to get in.
I have a feeling I'm gonna so students beware, you might want to mark this timestamp in me. This is where I got confused. Because I've been thinking about Tim's rational versus, I would just say maybe not rational. And this is what my thinking on it is in this last 5 minutes. Okay. Both classical republicanism and liberalism, or natural rights thinking, whatever the book calls it, it's all taking place in the milieu of the Enlightenment. So, I mean, Tocqueville says we have a thing called self-interest best understood, right? Where he's like, to exercise civic virtue, you're still exercising rationality, I would argue. And then the way Tim kind of just like slyly just stood in there, oh, maybe it was about rational or not. And I started thinking, all these modern books I'm reading, Jonathan Haidt's one of them, who talks about, you know what, how we really make decisions, both politically and in personal, we don't think. It's not logic, rational based. It's emotion. It's gut. And I think about this period before the Enlightenment where people are making decisions based on, I don't know, a belief in a supernatural, right? That's what the Enlightenment was breaking away from. And Tim just threw it out there, and I was just like, well, maybe that's another explanation of why we've seen the decline in democracy, not just in the United States, but everywhere the last 20 years. I mean, maybe this experiment thinking we can construct governments on a sense of rationality especially given what we've said on previous things about for rationality to work, you have to have a common set of facts that you're all going to agree with. To the extent that we no longer have those in line, has this just been a fun little blip in the human experience where we pretend we can master, we can be modern and master nature, but at the end, we're just all gut-seeking mammals, right? We're gonna go for the leader that protects us the most. And I don't know. I told you, students, now you can click, see what time it is. And that period where I just confused everything.
No, I love it. I love it. I think, I think that's great.
Well,
Chris?
that's like Socrates and pleasure, right? And the hedonistic ideas about regulating yourself, because man will always seek
Yeah.
that is what is pleasurable. But then you have to regulate that. So I mean, even Socrates was so.
Yeah.
In other words, Mike, you're channeling your inner Socrates.
I love it, man. I like it when I do that.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, you kind of just nibbled a little bit on my question here. And this, I actually read a column, and maybe it was the New York Times. I can't remember where I read it. And the individual said this. They said, you know, Jefferson identifies the pursuit of happiness as a natural right, but there really isn't any notion of the pursuit of happiness in classical Republican theory. Do you agree with that?
Um, no, I don't. I think I mean, go to Cicero. What's the role of government? Provide the greatest happiness to the most amount of people. Aristotle was talking about happiness. But what in their idea, their view of happiness, though, is going to be different than the Lockean view of happiness. So I got my handy dandy little pocket constitution, and years ago I was listening to Professor John Patrick, who was a pretty important person in this program. And we're doing Fed 10, and I've got it written here in my excerpt of Fed 10 somewhere. I got to find it now. Shoot. You would think that as much as we talked about Fed 10, it would fall right open to Federalist 10. But there's, and I wrote this note in the margin. Here it is. Sorry. And in Fed 10, they talk about the protection of these faculties as the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, see happiness, right? Or, the fact that Jefferson's plagiarizing Locke there, for the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the receptive proprietors. And anyways, Professor Patrick said this, he said this combines Cicero and Locke and happiness and property protected. So the idea by protecting that property, you're also protecting happiness, but it's also combining Cicero and his whole idea of happiness. I mean, the classical Republican idea of happiness, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it. I think it's called eudaimonia. It's spelled EUDAIMONIA. And it was an objective of the state to allow for human flourishing. Right. So to allow for people to flourish, because they know by people flourishing, that will make the community better. So when the government allows that, for thinkers like Aristotle and Cicero, the good life was inseparable from civic participation, because that was part of being in the polis. Right.
Well, it seems like to me you're somewhat disagreeing and agreeing, because there's a distinction here between individual happiness and collective happiness. Mr. Moore.
Exactly. Chris is exactly right on the flourishing piece. I mean, because Aristotle says happiness is a result of good governance. So happiness is, I would say, fundamentally important to at least Aristotelian classical republicanism. And so this idea of individualized happiness is not what Aristotle and many of the classicals are saying. It's like the freedom to be you within a community, the flourishing within a larger context really is. And Rosen Jeff Rosen's latest book, a book ago, The Pursuit of Happiness, he really brings this out quite well. So I think Chris is exactly right on the flourishing within the community is the definition
Well,
uh, that it's operating in the ancient world.
I mean, to the ancients, really, happiness was an ethical project. If you think about it, it's not a psychological one; it's more of an ethical one because a person became truly happy by
Yeah.
ordering by having order to their actions and desires toward the proper moral ends of mankind. Right. So the whole idea of the that whatever makes you happy, do it kind of thing. That would be make no sense to them.
Right. So would you guys agree that that ancient notion or classical notion, and even I would say going up to the 18th century of communalism as a source of happiness, that that's dead today? The notion of communalism being a source of happiness, all right, is dead today, and the notion of happiness is really an individual notion.
I would answer it depends on what kind of communities is you're seeking to exist within.
American communities,
Well, I don't, well, that's too, that's such a large
Wisconsin
scale.
communities. What do you
I mean,
want from me?
the way I read society, which is kind of scary since don't spend much time in it.
Too busy making
It seems
TikTok.
like everybody's searching for community. That's an amazing buzzword in the last 10 years. Community, community, community. Well, what now? So I think people are desirous. I mean, this whole Jonathan Haidt's notion of we're all isolated because we're on our phones. Well, there's no community there. And I think people intuitively know that. So I think the notion of community is still there. I just don't know that we figured out how to identify real ones.
I would
Well,
I would add it's dead to the extent if we read into the idea of community from the ancient world, it's wrapped up in a set of obligations you have to one another.
Yeah.
And as Chris has said, David, as you just sort of re-articulated, if all you see in pursuit of happiness is what's good for me, and you don't have any obligations, I would say yes, David, to the extent that we don't feel obligations to one another as much as we have in different other periods in the United States, then I would say, yeah, to that extent, that would be my metric of it. It's dying.
well, if the election of a president is the voice of the people, all right, I would say that's very clear because we elected a transactional individual that has no sense, has never articulated any sense, all right, of obligation to something larger than himself. It's all transactional. What is in it for me? And the majority of Americans, that they voted for that. So that's my piece of evidence. Chris, I know you wanted to jump in.
Well, I guess something I was going to say about that too, but people that are going to end up voting for the current administration also saw themselves as, doing. I'm sure they see themselves as being virtuous because they believe that there were some serious issues that needed fixing, and they thought this guy could fix it. How they were led to believe that is a whole nother story. But I think the other thing we're talking about here that we've moved away from this because we used to teach about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and that second R has seemed to go by the wayside. So I have the right to own a firearm? Yes, but you know what? I should use that firearm responsibly. Do I have the right to free speech? Yes, but does that require a responsible use of free speech in the public forum? So, and I think we moved to what Justice Jackson talked about, the Constitution being a suicide pact, perhaps, and people pursuing whatever makes them happy. I'm going to do it. And maybe this has given rise to that sovereign citizen movement that Tim has talked about. The idea that
Yeah.
my rights can't be superseded by anything, even the common good. So that we want to talk about rights, but we forget about the responsibilities of citizenship.
So, Mike, kids are asked to deal with the compatibility, which we've kind of been, been addressing as best we could, but been dealing with the compatibility of classical Republican with natural rights. All right, and a very key component of natural rights philosophy is the social contract. And it seems to me, and this seems to be echoing what we were just talking about, it seems to me that the social contract is dead as far as a guideline for how American political culture is supposed to function. Will you agree with that? Why or why not? Is a social contract dead?
It depends. Let me make this argument. Just like Tim was doing a second ago, as I was thinking about this,
The master of it depends, Tim Moore. Yes.
Well, I'm getting old, so
I mean, this idea of social contract, students, is this idea of like between the governed and the governed, there is a deal, right? And the people say to to those who are governing them, look, we will follow the laws, we will do the things you ask. You then protect our rights, protect our safety. The ratification of the Constitution, although it did not include every American at all, is to me one of the closest things we've had other than amendments of how do we know what that is? Like when is that mechanism? When do we know that we're all bought into that? To the extent that I think we do not have a strong national social contract. I don't know if we ever did. I think social contracts exist within smaller communities. I think we can talk about multiple social contracts. And to the extent to which those multiple social contracts were based on what Madison and others kind of theorized, that we were going to be moving through different interest groups and we were going to have different communities and different sets of social contracts. But to the extent that these things get frozen, right, into right, left, Democrat, Republican, blue, red, I think I think there are Americans that have very strong social contracts between themselves and the government, but they are kind of mutually exclusive of others. And so
how can it be social if it's exclusive of others?
because it's social for the group that is in it, we'll say we have a social contract, like what I don't want to go too down this rabbit hole because I'm going to just confuse the students once again. I just think there are multiple ones. I think the students should think about rights and obligations and the rules that that's set up on, and to ask themselves, how far does that extend to a national sort of area? I don't think it does that easily, and I don't know if it ever has, if we're really honest with ourselves.
I like that. Chris or Tim, thoughts on that?
Right.
yeah, I think Mike's point is the national social contract is you know, maybe it's always been thin, but I think I mean, you ask people that have moved to Idaho, up in the Panhandle there, up in the compounds. I mean, there's all kinds of pretty thick social, cultural contracts that have occurred all over the country, both on the right and the left politically. So I think to define social contract only, maybe to elaborate what Mike is saying, I don't know if it's what he's saying, but because he confused me. To define social contract only as a political contract, I think misses the point that there's all kinds of thousands of cultural contract that are going on in the country. Now, I don't know whether we want to define those as social contracts, but it seems to me there's all kinds of communitarian agreements that are going on around the country right now.
Well, aren't cultural contracts, aren't those reflective of classical republicanism rather than natural rights?
Or in religious groups that live in Idaho, it's like the covenantalism.
Right.
You know, Doug Wilson and all of his folks. Yeah, I think it's covenantalism rather than classical republicanism.
Chris?
Gosh, now I started thinking what Mike was saying. I just now got that figured out. And now I'm listening to Tim, and now I'm off on a different tangent. Not that even had what Mike was saying.
Can't imagine what the students are thinking right now.
My ideas are like Brazilian ironwood. It's unworkable.
You've been sitting on that one. That's good. That was really good. I think in terms of a national social contract, I don't know that we have one, because students are going to learn this when you start reading the Declaration of Independence. If you want to get really confused, go back and read Rousseau. But it's the idea that there's the government's, and this goes back to the part in Fed 10 I just read, right? about the government's role is to protect the different faculties in men from which we acquire property, but also to protect all of us so we get to do our own thing. But I have to be able to allow my neighbor to do his or her own thing as well, as long as it doesn't invade my own thing. So we have to, I think we have to provide space for people within our communities, no matter how large or how small we're talking about, to be able to do their own things. You know, that old quote we attribute to Voltaire: I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And this is where I think those compounds in the panhandle of Idaho, they're not willing to live in a broader community because they don't want to extend that liberty. I don't want to say freedom. They don't want to extend that liberty to the people that they do not agree with. So they're willing to isolate themselves in far-flung places so they can live the way they see fit and honor their social contract. But in a national sense, we have to have a government that provides that security and safety for us to, protect these different faculties that we have to and pursue what we want. But I also have to allow my neighbor to put a sign in his yard that's going to piss me off. And I don't know that people are willing to do that in terms of giving other people space. Does that make
All
sense?
right,
Or
gentlemen.
did I go down the Mike Williams rabbit hole?
Stop. Stop.
No, I thought it was a wonderful discussion. But we've come to the end of our time together on Unit 1 question here. So final thoughts and recommendations on behalf of the FLOPs here. So Professor Williams.
Yeah, I would recommend, I mean, this question, you're gonna have to dive into a lot of the colonial experience and the theory and all that kind of stuff. But as you try to think about how this applies to your daily life, maybe think of this instead of these natural rights philosophy, classical welcome, think about it in terms of rights versus responsibilities versus obligations, or rights and then responsibilities, obligations. Use that language and ask yourself and ask others what they think about responsibilities and obligations. Because that's where, like, maybe there's something that we've missed in this discussion where there's a lot of this going on amongst your own communities that we just weren't identifying enough. I'd be curious to see how you, through your lived experience, to put it in that language and ask yourself how much of my community does it have the right balance of people doing what they want versus people doing things for others or out of an obligation, and just see where that conversation gets you.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, my recommendation, I realize I've not held up a book in a while, and I think Tim's up on me a couple books. So I put this in our show notes, but I don't know if you can still find this in print, but if you can find a copy of this, teachers, add this to your bookshelves in your classroom. It was put together by people that know this program. Obviously, you see the name Margaret Branson on the front. She's one of the founding mothers of this program. This was a great Unit 1 book. Will help you deal with a lot of these issues, because the idea of classical republicanism, ancient philosophy, I think many teachers will struggle with that. I'm going to hold up one more. This one has been kind of rattling around on my, it's called Open Socrates, like Open Sesame. This is a scholar that deals in Socrates, and this is very interesting. I've been reading this one on virtue and Socrates and what he has to say. So this is, if you want to get a little deeper in the weeds, this would be a good one. I think this is a good question that students have to deal with. It's kind of a traditional we the people question. And I'm going to echo what Mike just said about your lived experiences. What about your school community? How do these discussions play out in your school community versus your rights as a student and your responsibilities as a student? And how does that play out in your local communities? Where do you see this playing out? So think about tangible examples that you can bring in to your discussion to support these viewpoints that you may be expressing.
Well done, gentlemen. I don't have anything else to offer other than to say to Mike.
Did Tim right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Gosh, I lost track here. I'm sorry, Professor Moore.
You're on
my
mute,
apologies.
Tim.
Yeah, I was feeling a little like I was in ancient Greece and being ostracized to go out on the hills and no longer be a part of the polis.
Right.
I mentioned Don Lutz, and there's two. He has two wonderful books. One he is a narrative book that goes through a lot of this stuff, but another one is a document book. I would really urge teachers to grab this, not just for this question, but in subsequent years too. Anytime you get a colonial experience question, Don Lutz's document book on the colonial period. He has hundreds and hundreds of documents from the colonial period. And you'll notice, I mean, on this idea of classical republicanism, you'll notice that a lot of that stuff comes through in his choice of documents. So Don Lutz's, I think it's called The Documentary History of American Colonial America or something like that. I'd recommend that.
Well, as I was saying, Mike, you said, hey, timestamp, this is where I got confused. That's usually about in the third minute of our program for me, especially when we're dealing with Unit 1. I thought you made, provide a lot of clarity there. I thought you all did. And the other thing is, I don't know if I've ever, or I like the phrase hopped off the boat, because I'm just thinking of Americans hopping. All right, colonials hopping around. We hopped off the boat and we hopped into the village, kind of thing. So before we go, I'd like to make an announcement to Unit 1 members. We are taping this program the week of October 13th. I would like to invite all teachers and students to participate in the No Kings movement on this Saturday, October 18th, a national rally protest. It's either for American constitutional government and the rule of law and representative government, or you could see it as a rally movement against authoritarian government by the current administration and their cult followers. And if you don't agree with that depiction, I would ask you just to look at what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. And in this past month and a half or so, the murder of 27 individuals by the United States government in violation of international and constitutional, American constitutional law. And just look at the number of raids going on in Chicago, Portland, LA. And many of these involved American citizens or legal residents. And you wonder what happened to the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. And this is all done under the pretext of fighting invasion or violence in American cities. It smells of the Palmer raids and McCarthyism all wrapped in one. So go to nokings.org to find out where the nearest rally for the No Kings movement is for you. And just remember, in a nation of cowards, I hope that you have the courage to stand up against tyranny. So when we meet next time, we're going to be talking about Unit 3, Question 3, the 13th Amendment, and the concept of the badges and incidences of that amendment. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye bonds.